One day the sage asked young Dingle to come to a nearby temple at a certain hour in the evening to witness an important ceremony. He went. Presently, in a corner of the temple courtyard, he saw pieces of iron being heated in a forge. In another corner was the sage, almost naked, going through breathing exercises such as a young man had never seen before. As Mr. Dingle says, it was the first time I had ever seen a man really breathe. After a time, the attendants at the forge came across to the sage, carrying with tongues 2 red-hot pieces of iron, upon which iron straps were riveted. They knelt at the feet of the sage and placed the pieces of iron beneath his feet, securing the straps over his insteps and around his ankles. While the young man looked on in amazement, his friend then walked slowly across the courtyard and back in what he now saw were red-hot sandals. Returning to the starting point, the sage sat down while the attendants quickly removed the sandals. Fearful that his friend had been hurt, the young man hastened across to him, but could observe no injury. Hardly able to believe what he saw, he put his finger on the iron to see if it was really hot, and burned himself severely. Though this happened several decades ago, to this day the scar in that burn may be seen on the finger of Mr. Dingle. From that day forward, the young man became a disciple of the sage of Singapore. He was instructed in certain methods and practices. He sought knowledge of the teachings of the East wherever he could find it, in books, manuscripts, from well-known mystics, and in temples. After he reached a certain point, however, the sage refused to teach him further unless he made a long pilgrimage. At first this requirement seemed insuperable. The young man, bred in Europe, could not look with oriental equanimity upon giving up his splendid position, his brilliant prospects. These were no light matters. But the sage, or guru, as teachers are called in the East, was adamant. The influences which had guided the young man's predilections from childhood finally prevailed. True, however, to his practical European training, he sought for a way to make his pilgrimage self-supporting. The Boxer uprising having been suppressed, the eyes of the world were upon China. He decided to make his pilgrimage in the remote interior of that country, sections which at that time were little known. And he would syndicate the story of his travels in newspapers throughout the world. Thus he was able to provide himself with a caravan for the journey, pack animals, and natives to accompany him. The animals were used for supplies, cameras, instruments, the requirements being that the young man should travel on foot after reaching the interior. This he did, except for short boat trips and an occasional ride to the next town when injured or sick. Though his trip was undertaken during the chaos following the Boxer uprising, through many sections where a white man had never been seen, though he had many hairbreadth escapes from bandits and twice from tigers, Mr. Dingle never carried a gun. He suffered from broken limbs, tropical diseases. Several times he recuperated in temples to the remote west of China, pursuing meantime his search for the inner wisdom, advancing always in his understanding of esoteric methods. The pilgrimage was a long one. Arriving in Upper Burma, almost dead from his hardships he had undergone, he saw his teacher again and was told, "They are waiting for you in Tibet." Nothing more. Arrangements had already been made for Mr. Dingle's transportation to Rangoon, and thence to England. It was doubtful whether he would live to complete the journey. It was almost certain that he could not survive the arduous trip to Tibet over mountain passes more than 3 miles above sea level, exposed to cold and fierce storms, and with, in that day, practically no conveniences for travelers. How powerful must have been the influences which impelled him to undertake the almost hopeless journey. True, Tibet in the heart of ageless Asia has been his dream since boyhood, that isolated spot on the map that has always fascinated him. Wondrous were the tales about it which he had heard in various temples. Intriguing were the conjectures of the books he had read, for at that time the country was practically a complete mystery to Occidentals. The young husband's expedition, by which England had attempted to invade the country in the 90s, had been unaccountably turned back without a battle. Its rulers forbade the presence of white men in any of its sacred cities. Forbidden Tibet was the name the world had given the mysterious land. Even the most daring man in the best of health might have been deterred from an undertaking fraught with great hardships, danger, and uncertainty. But a caravan was hastily assembled, and Edwin John Dingle set out upon the journey. Entering Tibet from the east, the young man had not gone far before a strange feeling came upon him. Scenes were vaguely familiar. It seemed as if he had traveled this route before. Every day this feeling grew stronger. He could anticipate the scenes which would greet him as he turned the next bend of the trail. Finally he arrived before the entrance of a temple. Every stone was familiar to him. A feeling of great relief and contentment came over him, as if, after many years, he had finally arrived at the memory-cherished home of his boyhood. As he entered with awe the strangely familiar temple, the young man's overwrought body at last collapsed altogether. For 4 days and 4 nights he remained unconscious. On the 5th morning he awakened. The crisis passed. As his eyes opened, there stood before him in the doorway a benign old man. Presently the old man said, "Art thou glad to be back?" The young man was so confused that the question was repeated. Then he replied, "Glad to be back? Glad to be back? Back where?" The young man knew that never in his lifetime had he been in this place before. Finally the sage explained that in a former lifetime the young man had been one of the Llamas in this very temple. He and the old man had been boys together. In his former lifetime the young man had disobeyed the rules of the order and had met a violent death. He had been reborn in England, while his boyhood companion had lived on at the temple. Hence the young man's faithful urge to be always on the move until he came to rest at last in this ancient Tibetan temple. Whether or not all this was true, the young man did not actually know at the time. Whether he has since learned that it was true is something he will probably never tell. Have no tongue is the precept of the East regarding certain sacred matters. But whether true or not, the sage believed it, and therefore welcomed the young man as the cherished friend of his boyhood, giving the greatest gift in his power, wisdom of the inner circle of Tibet, which had been cherished for thousands of years. Fortunate was the young man, otherwise he would have received only the elementary view with which most other visitors in Tibet must be content. Even more fortunate was he that his particular sage had a personal interest in and a love for him. In Tibet, as in all other countries, the truly wise ones are few and far between. Here as elsewhere, many are called, but few are chosen. Among the Lamas themselves, few are those who may be called masters. Indeed, every resident in a lamasery is called a Lama, some of them being mere laborers and artisans. The young man living in that Tibetan temple found his years of previous study and practice of the mystic wisdom of the East had prepared him for the postgraduate teachings which was now given him. Nevertheless, as the time for leaving approached, he was profoundly shocked when the master said, "There will come a time, my son, when nothing will content thee but to teach." For he felt wholly unprepared for such a task. Wisdom brings humility. His wise master knew that he was unprepared, but after many, many years of study and practice, during which the wisdom learned became a part of his very being, the time predicted finally came, when nothing will content thee but to teach. Since 1927, that has been his mission. I'd like to thank everyone for watching. Do the Dead Return?